were to ask right now, if you were to say, what are the 5 biggest question marks on the Eagles, right? You'd probably have linebacker, safety, quarterback play, wide receiver play in there, and maybe number 2 corner next to Darius Slay. Those are the same 5 positions that you had a big question about coming off the 4-11-1 season. So from a questions about the organization, not much has changed from your 4-win team to your 9-win team.
The matchup Monday here on Birds 365. We got the matchup in place for Super Bowl 56. That is just one of several topics we're going to discuss with our first guest. He's got a good banner there. He's looking pretty good in that banner, and not too bad here on our YouTube channel as well from InsideTheBirds.com and their Inside the Birds podcast. Our buddy Geoff Mosher hops aboard. How's the offseason treating you, Mosher? Looking good.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, last time you caught me with the bowl of cereal, so I made sure this time to be completely prepared to go. No cereal. Just I'm ready to go.
Most important meal of the day. No problem with that. And I want to give Jeff and Adam Kaplan, also friend of the show, credit. They were the first to report that Ian Cunningham was in the mix to be the assistant GM in Chicago. And that's exactly how it went down. So, as you mentioned, InsideTheBirds.com, Inside the Birds podcast with Jeff and Adam. Ryan Poles, Ian Cunningham, tell us about that connection and why is Ian? Ian's very highly regarded, as you know, Jeff. And a lot of people made fun of the Eagles and Jeffrey Lurie for saying GM factory, and I got 5 future GMs in the building. Turns out he might have 5 future GMs, now 4 or so, maybe even a little bit more long-term. Ian Cunningham, that Eagles front office, rest of the league looks at it and says, that's pretty good. I might want some of that.
Yeah. Ian interviewed last offseason, for the Carolina Panthers GM job, which eventually went to Scott Fitterer. So, Jeffrey was being sort of pat on the backish, but also fair that he does have a number of executives who will be looked at around the league. And Ian really was the third person from the Eagles front office this year to interview for a job. Obviously, Catherine Rach and Brandon Brown had interviews for the Minnesota GM vacancy, but Ian's the first to get it. The interesting thing with him, guys, is that as far as his relationship with Ryan Poles, what we were told was they were very close, and yet they never worked together. A lot of times you see guys like Andy Weidel or Joe Douglas, when he came to the Eagles, he started pulling guys from the Baltimore Ravens chain into the Eagles scouting department, Ian Cunningham being one, Andy Weidel being another. There were a few others. But as far as I can tell, these guys just know each other from the industry, the business. They both played their college football in the Big East. They're both former offensive linemen. But it was kind of the way we were getting it and the way I reported it, me and Adam, the night it happened, wasn't just that he was going to be on the list, but he was being targeted by Ryan Poles. And I had been told that it would be about a 90 to 95% chance of it happening pretty quickly. And as you saw, it did. He flew out there for an interview. And I think by Saturday, he was named the assistant general manager. So, the Eagles do lose a guy a well-respected guy in their front office. But one of the interesting things that the Eagles did when they promoted him is that I've seen the Eagles do this before, John, you've seen it too, but not too many other teams. But he had the same title as Brandon Brown. They were both directors of player personnel, like co-directors. And Ian, before he was elevated to that, was the director of college scouting. But the Eagles also have a senior director of college scouting, and Anthony Patch. So the question of how do we make up for Ian's loss, as people have asked, how do the Eagles do that? I say, well, they kind of built it into that the job he was doing, they have 2 other people who have either been doing it for a long time or that they value in how they do it. And so I don't necessarily know that they are panicking right now about finding a replacement, but they do lose a guy who is very respected.
Now, Jeff, let me ask you about the Eagles deciding to let Ian Cunningham go, because the rules of being able to block someone from taking a job or even interviewing for a job can sometimes get into that gray area. He didn't get the GM job. It was a GM job, be obvious. It would have been a promotion for him. This can be judged. Titles are different. Responsibilities are different as a quasi-lateral move. The Eagles didn't block it. They didn't attempt to block it. They allowed him to interview, and he got the gig. There's an upside and downside to both. If you block it, then you get to keep a good guy that you like, and he stays in your employee and he helps you going forward. But you also look like a team that's not allowing their people to grow. You want to be able, if you're going to hire people from other organizations, let them know, hey, you come in, you do a great job for us. You may go on to bigger and better things elsewhere. And when you let a guy like Ian Cunningham go, you're doing just that. So that's bode well for the future for them hiring guys. Was there ever any talk about, no, we kind of really need Ian Cunningham. It's just an assistant general manager position. We're going to block the Bears from even talking to him.
I don't know that there was, and I think a lot of that is what I just talked about as far as having really good, quality, competent people already in place to assume the responsibilities that he was assuming. I think that the Eagles understand that this is a big part of the business where you're going to have guys who are on your hierarchy, do well, and leave other places. If you look at it from his Ian's point of view in the Eagles, he is now the number 2 guy in the Chicago Bears scouting chain. Ryan Poles is number 1. He's number 2. He's the assistant general manager. With the Eagles, Howie Roseman's number 1. Andy Weidel is still number 2. And you can sort of make an argument about whether Ian was the clear 3 when he's sharing the same job title as Brandon Brown, who's also interviewing. So if the Eagles wanted to keep Ian, they would have to match the kind of salary that he's going to be making in Chicago, increase his title, and then the domino up effect would have to happen. If you increase his title, what are you going to do with Andy Weidel, who's ahead of him, and with Brandon Brown, who's sort of tied with him in that regard? And I think that that's why they understand that losing and gaining guys is just part of the deal in this business. And they try to have – the Eagles probably have a bigger personnel and scouting department than most NFL teams. They have assistants out the wazoo. And same thing with coaching staff. They've got an assistant at almost every position. Not every NFL team has assistant coaches for specific positions. So I think that it would have been complicated for them to try to retain Ian without kind of having to then reward or elevate 2 other guys, and that means promotions and more money for everybody else.
Yeah, and I would argue, Jeff, that Catherine's actually the buffer between Andy and Howie. So she's technically ahead of Andy Weidel. And then you have Dave Caldwell. People forget Dave Caldwell's here. And it's sort of murky as far as where Dave's a former GM of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the Eagles are very deep in the front office, and this is a really good promotion for Ian Cunningham. Plus, he's a minority candidate, so the NFL is not going to look at it very well if you try to block him from taking that kind of step with the Chicago Bears.
I would add to that, John, but the only reason I didn't mention Catherine's name, and this is where the murkiness really comes in, is because the Eagles sort of define their scouting staff as the scouting staff and then the football administration staff, right? So Catherine sort of falls under that. I work under Howie and his department and not necessarily with – I'm sure she obviously does tape and things like that, but if you go to their website, they even have it like kind of 2 separate staffs that work together. So in that regard, you're right. It does cloud where was Ian, but he was number 3 on the personnel. But if you did open up the whole front office, you're right. He could be bumped down to technically 4 or lower.
And it's interesting because, Catherine, when Andrew Berry was here for a very short time, she took his job, and Howie explained that he knew Andrew Berry was going to get a GM job pretty quickly in this league, and he turned out to be right. So he had Catherine shadowing Andrew Berry. I imagine whether it's Anthony Patch or somebody of that nature, he had them shadowing sort of what Ian did, and the Eagles will be ready for this. So I want to shift with you to the coaching staff because this is a little bit different to me for this reason, Jeff. When Sean Payton called it a career, we were at 9 teams searching for head coaches at some point in this hiring cycle. Some have already made their decisions, obviously. That's nearly 30% of the league. It's a very nomadic profession. But I think people forget when you change coaches, there's going to be big churn in coaching staffs. And we've already seen it when Matt Eberflus got the got the job in Chicago, Kevin Patullo's name was floated for offensive coordinator. They went in a different direction because Green Bay's getting hit so hard. Brian Johnson was going to interview there to be offensive coordinator. Now they promoted from within. But there's got to be 9 staffs populated in this league. So whether it's Jonathan Gannon getting the big job in Houston, Patullo, Brian Johnson, I don't know who's going to go, who's going to stay. But there's going to be some turnover, and it's not just going to be from Jeffrey Lurie scapegoating somebody for a bad game in Tampa. I mean,
that's true.
People are going to get pulled. Have you ever? It's a nomadic profession to begin with, but this is going to be historic as far as movement with assistant coaches around the NFL.
I think the Jonathan Gannon hire is definitely holding up anything that may go on with the Eagles and their coaching staff. I like to joke, and I wrote it recently, I think last week, that no team hires and fires position coaches like the Eagles. No team that makes the playoffs hires and fires position coaches as much as the Eagles do. I mean, in 2019, they made the playoffs and they fired 3 guys. Yeah. So they every year, what have they had? 5 wide receivers coaches in 6 years, 4 defensive line coaches in 4 years. So I thought it was very telling, John, that Nick Sirianni, and by the way, it shows you that he's a little bit more advanced in the press conference than Doug Peterson. In his final press conference, he didn't say everybody was coming back. Yeah. He said he was in high evaluation mode. And I'm sure that there are positions that they look at on the team that underperformed, and they think we may need to make changes there. However, some of those changes, as you're bringing up, might be made for them if Jonathan Gannon gets a head coaching job and says, I want this guy, I want that guy. And they're going to say, oh, too bad. All right, go ahead. So they're waiting for, I believe, these dominoes to fall among the coaching staff. So as we sit here today, and amazingly, the Senior Bowl is going to start soon and guys are going to go down, they are representing the Eagles with probably wondering a little bit about what their future and what their fate is going to be, especially guys, John, whose 2-year contracts are probably up, because now is the time you start talking about whether you're renewing or keeping and or not keeping. And if you haven't renewed by now and you're an Eagles position coach, you're probably kind of like, what's going on here? And they're probably telling you, well, we got to wait for some dominoes to fall. It's a very you're perfect in describing it as a nomadic job, but it's also a job filled with a lot of purgatory at this time of the year where you really may not know what your status is going to be until other dominoes fall.
Most, it seems to cut both ways. The fact that Jonathan Gannon's had a couple of interviews for the Houston job, but he hasn't gotten it. And there are 6 other jobs that they haven't decided yet. 3 have, 6 haven't. McNown and Gannon seem to be the 2 forerunners, but they both had plenty of opportunity to get hired and haven't been hired yet. How are you reading the tea leaves? Is Gannon going to get it or not?
I'm reading that as the Houston Texans don't know what they're doing. Surprise! Jody, when's your interview? You guys, you might right there. You guys could be head coach and defensive coordinator for the Houston Texans. It's not a very desirable job. I know that someone's going to take it. Right. Someone's going to take it. It's one of 32. And obviously that's why you see guys like Jonathan Gannon, who's not coming off some amazing year as defensive coordinator, and Josh McCown, who's never coached in the NFL at a position before, as front runners for that job, because anybody who's qualified for that job is probably like, I'll just wait it out for next year and a different team. So that's what I make of it, is that the Houston Texans don't exactly know what they're doing and have shaky leadership and are going to wind up making a very, very odd and sort of probably regretful decision as their head coach.
Well, I'd throw Jacksonville in that category as well. They've wanted Byron Leftwich for weeks, but they won't give up on Trent Baalke. What a disaster that organization is. But I'll take it from a positive spin. One more question on the coaching staff, and I bring up Patullo and Brian Johnson again. These guys are young coaches. We know how this league is, and the Eagles were ahead of the curve as they usually are. I led this chorus, so I'll take the hits. I was concerned about the lack of experience going into this past season on the coaching staff, but now all of a sudden, the rest of the league is catching up and saying, "I want this young 40-year-old Kevin Patullo. I want a 34-year-old offensive coordinator, Brian Johnson." We'll see if it shakes out that way. But 9-9 ultimately is what the Eagles ended up, which is better than most people expected. But this isn't the 13-win team like Green Bay, where everybody's poaching the coaching staff. What is it about this staff that people are sniffing around and most interested in?
Well, I think you hit it on the head. And if I were you, I wouldn't, take the L yet. I mean, we're talking about a quarterback's coach and a passing game coordinator for a team that, had modest passing game play and modest quarterback play at times. So I think it's more about the youth movement and the familiarity, at least as far as maybe like a Kevin Patullo, because he interviewed in Green Bay. There's some connection, right? Eberflus. No.
Yeah, Eberflus.
Yeah, Eberflus.
Yeah, they were both in Indy together. Yeah.
Right. So there's at least a connection there. And Brian Johnson's interesting. I mean, it's just like the Jonathan Gannon thing, getting a head coach look. It's not like the quarterback and the passing game was so flashy that Brian Johnson all of a sudden would be bang on the radar. Let's bring him in. But again, sometimes you bring in guys for intel. Sometimes you're just trying to figure out what they're all about. I'm shocked that no team has thought to interview Jeff Stoutland just for the sake of finding out what his process is all about. Why wouldn't you bring him in? Maybe you're a owner who says, I'll never have an offensive line guy as my head coach because, Tom Cable, that's why, or whatever. I mean, there's very few offensive linemen who become head coaches. Although I would.
What about you mentioned the assistants, Jeff? Roy Isban, Jeff's assistant.
Sure.
I mean, why isn't he getting an offensive line job? And maybe he gets one.
You would think. I would argue Mike Munchak has been a really good NFL coach. I mean, especially and also an offensive coordinator in this league, and he's a former offensive lineman as well. I just had to shout out my Penn State guy there. You know that. So, but no, he has been. So I'm just surprised someone doesn't bring in Jeff Stoutland just to pick his brain, even if they don't want to hire him. Just get his why are you so good at developing offensive linemen when it's such a sore spot around the league, and he's done such a good job of it. So I've kind of not figured out the whole cycle of why people are brought into interviews, why people get jobs, why people don't. We were just talking about the Eagle scouting chain. The number one guy in the Eagle scouting chain under Howie Roseman is Andy Weidel. Yeah. He's got 0 interviews while the guys underneath him are getting interviews. So there's a lot to it that doesn't make sense. But, at the end of the day, guys get looked at. They get a chance to share their vision, guys or girls, I should say, women. And we'll see what happens. We'll see how it shakes out. But I do your thing about the Eagles being 9-7 and then or eventually 9-9. I think that's fair. I think it's a fair point. If you were to ask right now, if you were to say what are the 5 biggest question marks on the Eagles, right? You'd probably have linebacker, safety, quarterback play, wide receiver play in there, and maybe number 2 corner next to Darius Slay. Those are the same 5 positions that you had a big question about coming off the 4-11-1 season. So from a questions about the organization, not much has changed from your 4-win team to your 9-win team. That's because we know the 4-win team was more talented than 4 wins. It shouldn't have been a 4-win team. It wasn't a great team, but it was better than that. The injuries happened. And we also know the 9-win team is not really the playoff team. That's thanks to the expanded playoff. It's not as good as it may look. They didn't beat anybody. So they still have a ton of work to do.
All right, Moshe, I got one more coaching question for you. And yes, would this be better directed at Frank Reich? Probably, but we'll settle for the Geoff Mosher inside here.
Oh, boy.
May the Schwartz be with you? Really?
Yeah.
Jim Schwartz coming out of retirement to take a DC job in Indianapolis?
Oh, he didn't retire. He retired for 20 days.
Yeah, that retirement was about as did they give him anything as a retirement present? I don't think so. They talked about his health and I hope he's okay and he's going to be. He needs the time off, and then he's about you drink a cup of coffee and then he's working for the Titans. Yeah, that man wanted out. That's the truth of it, and he's not the only one. And of course, now he's back in and somewhere else. So I mean, that's just the reality of the situation.
And he's a very good defensive coordinator. But I do want to shift to Championship Sunday, Jeff, and get your thoughts, because Jody and I were talking about this town and the history with Andy Reid, and Andy's getting killed, can't win the big one. He's there again, 21-3 lead. Andy Reid versus Patrick Mahomes. I mean, who's responsible? It starts at the end of the first half. I mean, Patrick Mahomes has to understand that situation. Am I correct?
You are absolutely correct.
And I'm sure he's told.
Yes. I mean, he's not a rookie. He's not a first or a second-year quarterback. He's a Super Bowl champion. He's been in that spot 4 years in a row. So I don't blame the coach for trusting the quarterback there to make the right decision. I blame the quarterback for making the wrong decision. I think he had a reckless second half. He ran around too much. I think his gift became his curse because he made a couple of Russell Wilson-esque type plays in the first half where he spun away and then made something happen. Then he tried to do that in the second half, and instead of throwing balls away at times, he took hits, he took sacks. I mean, he really put his team in a bad spot. And I'm really disappointed. I obviously love watching Patrick Mahomes play, and I was really hoping this year for a Mahomes-Rodgers Super Bowl. I never seem to get my Mahomes or my Rodgers versus elite guys. I wanted Rodgers-Brady for the longest time, didn't get that. Now we get no Rodgers-Mahomes, and to be honest with you, it's the Super Bowl, so of course it'll be fun, but, Rams-Bengals –
Joe Burrow's
compared to what you could have had going in. It is true. I enjoy, obviously, the Joe Burrow story is great, and they better win it this year because when you play in that AFC North and you have Baltimore and Pittsburgh to contend with every year, it's tough to start your own little New England-like dynasty because you don't have the Jets and Dolphins and Bills, what they Bills used to be, to pummel for six wins a year. So the Bengals better take care of business this year.
Does the Bengals going from 4-11-1 to the Super Bowl lift the hopes of the Eagles fans? Now the Eagles, if they're going to the Super Bowl next year, only jumping from 9-7 or 9-8 or 9-9, depending on how much emphasis you put on those last two games. Does it lift the spirits and or the hopes of Eagle fans to watch the Bengals make the huge jump they did?
I don't know. Are the Eagles trading for Joe Burrow after the Super Bowl? Because then maybe you would think that. But, the one thing I've seen in the NFL is that you can find plenty of examples of linear development, like you just mentioned the Bengals. You can also find a lot of examples of teams just kind of like, they win and they lose a little bit next year, then they're back up, like the Chicago Bears. I mean, they've been in the playoffs twice in the last 4 or 5 years. But if you kind of look at them in the big picture, you say, man, they've been kind of rotten. I mean, they're on a new GM, they're on a new head coach. Nagy was lambasted for at least 2 of the last 4 years. Same thing with the Vikings. They've been in the playoffs a couple of times, but they're like this. They're up and they're out. A lot of the league is like that. It's not as common anymore, I think, where you see the team always you win 4, then you win 7, then you win 9, then you're in the Super Bowl next year. It's the parity and the expanded playoffs have made it a little bit cloudy, I'd say, to really try to figure out year to year who you are.
I'm going to go in a different direction with the Eagles and Championship Sunday, and that's the LA Rams, because, Jeff, the Rams went all in. The Rams went, we're going to get veteran players. Mm-hmm. They don't have a first-round pick, I think, until 2024. They said, screw that. We want to get Matthew Stafford and Von Miller and Odell Beckham Jr. in the process, and obviously years past Jalen Ramsey, on and on and on, superstar players. Then you develop a couple, Cooper Kupp, still got the offensive line, Andrew Whitworth, ageless, seems. Does that embolden Howie Roseman as a guy who in the past has gone all in, so to speak, that maybe this is the better way to do it? Because people value draft picks too much in this league, Jeff. They value uncertainty over proven players. I've never understood it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. I think it does open the eyes to a new way of thinking. Everything's a calculated kind of maneuver. I think the Rams understood that with their coaches and with their talent going into the year, that unless everything fell under, of course, there's always a chance you might collapse like the Eagles did 2 years ago, have a lot of injuries, but they were going to be a pretty decent team and in contention. And when you're doing that year after year, like, the Steelers or the Ravens, you're usually picking 22nd to 30 in the draft. And the percentages of that player being a really good player are drastically lower than picking in the top 10. And they knew they weren't going to be picking in the top 10. So if they can flip first-round talent, as you're mentioning, John, which is a 50% chance of hitting on a guy, for someone like Matthew Stafford or Odell Beckham or Von Miller, guys who are proven, as you mentioned, in this league, you're just analytically, you're doing yourself better in that regard. So every GM, whether it's Howie or whatever, has to kind of examine their 53, examine where they are in the landscape, and are they closer to being a team picking in the bottom 10, or are they closer to being a team picking in the top 10 where you do get the elite talent, and then you kind of have to make the decision for there? The Rams have been good and good enough to contend for quite a while because of how they had built the team. And so they knew that they were more likely to be in the bottom 10 picking. So why not give away those picks and go for it all?
Jeff, let me ask you about a guy who's got one more game to play this year, but then can be a free agent at the end of the year, and how he could potentially fit here in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. We all agree the Eagles need to improve at wide receiver. Some guys who've been drafted over the last few years who've been massive underachievers, one of which may have a roster spot just because it costs more to cut them than to keep them. You know who I'm referring to. The guy I'm asking about is Odell Beckham Jr., who major performance Giants, gets traded for a king's ransom to the Browns. Absolutely doesn't fit there. Was it his fault? Was it the quarterback's fault? They end up releasing him. He decides to sign with the Rams, minimal money, take a run at a ring, and now he might very well get it. He's playing real well for the Rams. Cooper Kupp is the star. He's filling that number 2 role pretty darn well. We know he's a diva. We know he's a little bit of a nut job, but he's still a talented player. How would he fit with the Eagles? Would he have a problem being number 2 to Devonta Smith? Odell to the Eagles? Where does Mosher land?
Well, would he fit? Yes. He'd fit pretty much any offense. Will Howie Roseman go out and get him?
Cleveland, where we saw Cleveland, and that kind of fell flat on its face.
Yeah. I'm not sure any wide receiver has really fit the Cleveland offense pretty well over the last 2 or 3 years. But I don't see him being the Howie Roseman type of move, only because, as you're mentioning, he's shown that he can still play in this league as long as you put him with some decent quarterback play. So he's probably going to get a multi-year deal from somebody. If you look at all of Howie Roseman's wide receiver acquisitions since he came back to power in 2016, they've all been bargain kind of moves. Even the Alshon Jeffrey move was a 1-year deal because Alshon had a lot of question marks about injury history and PED history, and he didn't give him the extension until 3 years. A year, half the year in. So everybody else has been kind of bargain, right? I mean, Mike Wallace was a bargain 1-year deal. Torrey Smith was a 2-year deal. Deshaun Jackson was, let's trade a 6th-round pick and give him a contract extension. Kamar Aiken, he's not really at that position. Look to free agency for a huge deal, more so than a bargain. And if you look at this year's list of free agents, there are a ton of guys who are just good enough to get 1 or 2 year deals and kind of help you out, like a Juju Smith-Schuster, and guys kind of in that category that I think he'll target more than let me go reward a guy with a 3-year, $40 million deal at that position.
All right, last one from me, Mose. Can't let you go without talking about the quarterback situation. Before that, InsideTheBirds.com, Geoff Mosher, Adam Kaplan, Inside the Birds podcast. Make sure you download it where you get all your favorite podcasts. But look, I just talked about the Rams going all in. We can talk about the other players. We can talk about the OBJs, the Von Millers, but it comes down to the quarterback, right? Matthew Stafford, who isn't a superstar, but he's a really good quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
If the Philadelphia Eagles can find a way to swing Russell Wilson, and who knows if he wants to play here, and who knows where Deshaun Watson's going to be from a legal standpoint, and if he wants to play here. To date, he has not. How far is this team away from being the Los Angeles Rams? Does Russell Wilson elevate that 500 team into 12, 13? We're drafting in the bottom 10 category that you were talking about, and allow the Eagles to go all in with a player like OBJ or another star player at another position?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question, John. I think people kind of overestimate the ability to have that quarterback come in and lift your organization. I've heard people say you can't give up all those first-round picks for Russell Wilson, and then you have all these other holes on your team. And at first, I would say, I'm not sure it's going to cost you 3 first-rounders, all your 3 in this year's draft, because nobody else has 3. So who are you competing against? Somebody who's willing to give you 1 or 2 and then a future, where you can give your 2 and a future or something else or a player to match that. So you can still have your first-round pick, and they have 10 other picks in this year's draft to be able to use. Now, obviously, you have to hit on that. They also have good free agency money. So you can go trade some picks for Russell Wilson and have a pretty good offense, I would think, and have enough money to sign one of those veteran receivers I was talking about, and still have enough money to bring in some help on the back end of your defense, whether it's corner, safety, or linebacker, or both, and then draft well. It's not impossible, and it gives you, in my opinion, a better chance to win. Now, especially if Aaron Rodgers winds up leaving Green Bay and going to the AFC, and then you've just taken Russell Wilson and put him on your roster. So who are you worried about beating in the playoffs now? Matthew Stafford, really, and Russell Wilson has done that before. So I do think you can be a championship team and trade for Russell Wilson and not have to give up like every single pick that you have and mortgage your entire future and be right there. Because you have your offensive line and defensive line, and that's the strength and the backbone of your team. And he would just add to that, obviously.
All right, Moshe, my final question is this. Since we won't ask you to come on in the next 2 weeks again, we appreciate it whenever you do. We try not to abuse the privilege. Who's going to win the Super Bowl? You. Who's going to win the Super Bowl and why? Rams or Bengals?
Yeah, I think the Rams, if I were handicapping it, I would think the Rams, to me, especially playing in their own stadium, would be, I think what the early line I saw was 3.5 to 4. I think the Rams are probably 5.5 to 6. If I were handicapping, I think that they're a touchdown. I love the Joe Burrow story, but you can't, as a objective football analyst, think that offensive line of the Bengals, especially the inside, is not going to be in trouble against Von Miller and Aaron Donald. I don't see it. I honestly think that when they won the game in the divisional round, despite getting sacked 9 times, there was a little bit of lightning striking twice. That won't happen again, and I just think they're going to be overwhelmed by that defense.
I'll tell you how, Jeff. A couple bad Sean McVay decisions. You're right in the game.
Yes, yeah, that's true. That's true. And imagine if that guy hadn't dropped that interception for the 49ers, what we'd be saying today. It would be a repeat Super Bowl of the early 80s with San Francisco and Cincinnati.
Twice, 81 and 88. Yeah, 49ers, Bengals.
But this time, Joe Cool's on the other sideline. Last time he was on the 49ers sideline. Different Joe Cool on the Cincinnati sideline. We'll see how cool he is against that pass rush from the Rams. Excellent point from our buddy Geoff Mosher, who we thank for hopping on board. Mosher, enjoy the Super Bowl. We'll get you on plenty during the offseason, brother.
Appreciate it, guys. Have a great one.
Thanks, Jeff.
InsideTheBirds.com and Inside the Birds podcast. Our buddy Geoff Mosher with his pal, Adam Kaplan. My pal is John McMullen. We are the Mac and Mac Birds 365 guys. We'll come back. We haven't really talked about that Brady guy yet. Plenty on the Super Bowl, more so on Andy Reid / Patrick Mahomes, maybe a little bit more on the Rams and the 49ers. But, yeah, the story that kind of rocked the National Football League this weekend was, is Tom Brady retiring? I'll get John Mac's thoughts next here on Birds 365.
Go for the mid.